The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy and uncomfortable. All eyes were on a young black woman standing at the defendant's table. Dr. Aaliyah Monroe held her head high, her posture calm and steady. She didn't flinch as the judge, Richard Fallon, stared down at her from his elevated seat. The air in the room was tense, and even the spectators could feel something wasn't right. Judge Fallon was infamous for his tough rulings. He was also known for having certain prejudices. People whispered about it behind his back, but no one dared to confront him. Today, it seemed, Aaliyah was the target of his unyielding judgment. Aaliyah had been accused of stealing from an expensive boutique downtown, a case that had no solid evidence against her. There were no witnesses, no footage, and no clear proof that she had done anything wrong. But Judge Fallon didn't seem to care. His face showed no sympathy as Aaliyah's lawyer, Ms. Perez, tried her best to explain. "Your Honor," Ms. Perez said, her voice calm but firm, "my client has no prior record, no motive, and no evidence linking her to this crime. The accusation itself is baseless." Judge Fallon didn't even glance at the defense lawyer. Instead, he leaned forward and fixed his gaze on Aaliyah. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Ms. Monroe?" he asked, his tone cold. Aaliyah's heart raced, but she didn't let it show. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I have done nothing wrong, Your Honor. I believe in justice, and I trust the truth will come out." Her words hung in the air, but the judge remained unmoved. "Trust the truth," he repeated mockingly. "The truth, Ms. Monroe, is that the evidence is sufficient for this court." Several people in the courtroom exchanged confused glances. What evidence? They wondered. It was clear to everyone that the case was weak, but the judge seemed determined to make an example of her. Ms. Perez stood again. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the prosecution has failed to present any credible evidence. It's unfair to proceed with sentencing." Judge Fallon slammed his gavel. "Enough. I've made my decision." The harsh sound echoed through the room, making even the onlookers jump. Aaliyah's sentence was harsh, far beyond what the situation called for. Gasps filled the courtroom as the judgment was read. Some whispered, others shook their heads in disbelief. Still, Aaliyah remained calm. Her serenity puzzled the judge. Most people in her position would be furious, pleading, or devastated. But not Aaliyah. She stood tall, her expression unwavering. It was as if she knew something that no one else did. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, a quiet murmur spread through the crowd. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "Why does she seem so confident?" Judge Fallon tried to ignore the unease growing inside him. But deep down, something about this case didn't sit right. And soon, he would find out why. The courtroom was now empty, but Judge Richard Fallon sat alone in his chambers, flipping through the case file with a deep frown on his face. He had sentenced hundreds of defendants before, but something about Dr. Aaliyah Monroe lingered in his mind. Her calmness during the trial, her unshakable composure, bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. Most people begged for leniency or broke down under pressure, not Aaliyah. She had acted like she already knew the outcome didn't matter. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, reporters were swarming. The harsh sentence given to Aaliyah had already caught the attention of the media. Journalists waved microphones and cameras in her direction, shouting questions as she exited with her lawyer, Ms. Perez. "Aaliyah, do you have anything to say about the judge's decision? Do you think you were treated fairly? What will you do next?" Aaliyah raised a hand, her calm demeanor silencing the chaotic crowd. Her voice was steady and clear. "I have no comment at this time. Justice always has a way of revealing itself. Thank you." The reporters exchanged curious glances. Her response wasn't angry or desperate. It was confident, almost mysterious. They sensed there was more to the story, and it only made them more determined to dig deeper. Ms. Perez looked at her client with a mix of admiration and concern as they walked to the car. "Aaliyah, we need to talk about an appeal. The sentence was completely unfair." We have grounds to fight this. Aaliyah smiled faintly. I understand, Ms. Perez. But let's wait. Timing is everything. The lawyer furrowed her brow, but didn't push further. Aaliyah had a way of speaking that made people trust her instincts, even when they didn't fully understand her reasoning. Back in Judge Fallon's chambers, his assistant, Susan, knocked lightly before entering. Sir, I thought you'd want to know. There's already a buzz in the media about the case, she said, placing a stack of papers on his desk. People are questioning the fairness of your ruling. The judge scowled. The media always stirs things up. This case was straightforward. She was guilty. Susan hesitated before speaking again. Sir, about Dr. Monroe. I've been looking into her background, and there's something you should know. Judge Fallon looked up sharply. What do you mean? Susan handed him a printed article. Dr. Aaliyah Monroe isn't just anyone. She's a Harvard-educated lawyer, a human rights activist, and a keynote speaker at global conferences. She's helped reform justice systems in other countries. The judge froze, staring at the article. A photo of Aaliyah accompanied the headline. Champion of Justice, Aaliyah Monroe's mission to end inequality. He felt his stomach tighten as he read further. Her accolades and achievements were listed one after another, painting a picture of someone far different from the petty criminal he had judged earlier. How could this be? He muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't she say anything about who she is? Susan gave a small shrug. Maybe she wanted to see if justice would work without her reputation getting in the way. Judge Fallon's hands shook slightly as he placed the paper down. For the first time in years, doubt crept into his mind. He had always believed in his own decisions, but now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. Judge Richard Fallon couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As he sat in his chambers, the picture of Aaliyah Monroe from the article continued to haunt him. A woman who had the world at her feet, yet he had sentenced her without even knowing her story. Curiosity gnawed at him. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the photo of Aaliyah on his desk. He had to know more. How could someone with such a powerful resume and global influence end up in his courtroom facing such a baseless charge? He asked his assistant, Susan, to dig deeper into Aaliyah's past. The assistant hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. I'll find out what I can. Susan worked tirelessly over the next few hours, searching through news articles, interviews, and legal reports. The more she uncovered, the more she realized just how impressive Aaliyah truly was. She wasn't just a human rights lawyer. She was a well-known advocate for justice and equality. Aaliyah had studied at Harvard Law and traveled across the world, working to fight oppression in various countries. She had met heads of state and collaborated with global organizations to improve the lives of the disadvantaged. There were countless stories of her championing the voiceless, from helping refugees to challenging corrupt governments. Her voice had been one of strength and conviction, a beacon of hope in many parts of the world. Susan printed out more details, her eyes widening in amazement. Aaliyah wasn't just a high-profile lawyer. She was a force for change. She had appeared in interviews with international news outlets, giving powerful speeches on the need for reform in justice systems worldwide. Aaliyah had made a name for herself long before she ever stepped foot in Judge Fallon's courtroom. What is she doing in a case like this? Susan whispered to herself. How could someone with such a remarkable reputation be caught up in something as trivial as theft? There had to be more to the story. The more Susan thought about it, the more she became convinced that something was off. Why hadn't Aaliyah mentioned her background during the trial? Was it possible that she was testing the system, hoping that the truth would prevail on its own? Susan couldn't ignore the possibility that Aaliyah had a larger plan. She could have easily used her fame to fight the case from the start, but she hadn't. Instead, she remained quiet, even when the judge had made his biased ruling. Susan entered Judge Fallon's chambers with the printed materials. She placed them on his desk, watching him carefully. Sir, I found a lot more about Dr. Aaliyah Monroe. She's not just any defendant. She's an influential figure in the world of human rights, I think we've underestimated her." The judge took the papers and began to read, his face growing paler with each line. The facts were undeniable. Alia Monroe had done more for justice than most people could even dream of accomplishing in a lifetime. As the weight of his ignorance settled in, Judge Fallon's doubt grew stronger. Could it be that Alia had known all along how this would play out? Had she been waiting for him to make a mistake? The judge put down the papers, his mind racing. One thing was certain: he had made a serious misjudgment. Judge Richard Fallon sat at his desk, staring at the pile of documents Susan had given him. The more he read about Alia Monroe, the worse he felt. He had been so quick to judge her, to dismiss her case without truly understanding who she was. Now, as he read about her accomplishments, the reality of his mistake hit him harder than ever. Alia had spent years fighting for the rights of people who had no voice. She had spoken at the United Nations, traveled to war-torn countries, and worked on issues that most people couldn't even imagine. She was a symbol of strength, of fairness, and of justice. Yet here he was, having sentenced her without a second thought. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the papers. The reality of the situation was sinking in. Alia had been quiet throughout the trial. She hadn't revealed her background or her connections, perhaps to test the system, perhaps to see if justice would prevail on its own. Susan, standing at the door, watched the judge closely. She had seen him make many decisions over the years, but this one was different. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the unease that had settled in his chest. "Sir, I think you should reconsider your decision," Susan said gently. "This isn't just about a simple theft case. This is about much more." The judge looked up, his face tight with frustration. "I know," he said quietly. "I've made a huge mistake. But how could I have known? She never mentioned who she really was." Susan paused, choosing her words carefully. Maybe she didn't want to use her status as a way to win. Maybe she wanted to see if the system would work the way it's supposed to, without the influence of who she is. She trusted that the truth would come out. Judge Fallon rubbed his forehead, deep in thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been blind to the truth. Alia's silence, her calm demeanor during the trial, it all made sense now. She hadn't fought back because she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about the bigger picture. "I've ruined her life," he muttered to himself. "I've tarnished her reputation. And for what? Because of my own prejudices." Susan's voice softened. "It's not too late, sir. You can fix this." But the judge wasn't sure how. He had made the decision. Alia had been sentenced. The courtroom had already seen his judgment, and now it was too late to undo what he had done. Or was it? The judge sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of his actions. He couldn't simply ignore the truth anymore. He knew that he had to make things right, no matter how difficult it would be. Suddenly, an idea came to him. If he couldn't undo the judgment, maybe there was something else he could do. Maybe he could expose the truth and make sure that Alia's voice was heard, that the injustice of her case was corrected. He looked at Susan with determination. "We need to do something," he said firmly. "I need to reach out to her, to make amends." Susan nodded, seeing the change in him. The judge had realized what he had done. Now, the real question was how he would fix it. As the news of Alia Monroe's harsh sentence spread, it didn't take long for the media to take notice. The story went viral almost immediately. Headlines screamed about the injustice of the ruling, with many questioning how such a prominent figure could end up in court for a case so weak. People were shocked, and the backlash against Judge Richard Fallon grew louder by the minute. TV stations ran stories about Alia's background, her work as a human rights advocate, her years of fighting for justice around the world, and her role in important global discussions. The media painted a picture of a woman who had done nothing wrong, yet had been unfairly treated in the courtroom. As journalists uncovered more details about her life, they couldn't help but compare her reputation with the judge's questionable past. Soon, social media exploded. Tweets, Facebook posts, and Instagram stories flooded in, all calling for justice for Alia. Supporters from all corners of the world rallied behind her. They expressed outrage at how someone so well-respected and dedicated to helping others could be treated this way. It wasn't just a case of wrongful sentencing. It was a glaring example of how the justice system sometimes failed those who most needed it. People began to ask, how could this happen in a modern court of law? Alia, however, kept quiet. She had made no public statements since the verdict, even though everyone was waiting for her response. The world was watching her every move, but she refused to give them the drama they expected. Her silence only made people more curious. Was she preparing for something big? Was she planning to fight back in a way no one could anticipate? Meanwhile, Judge Fallon was feeling the pressure. He had never been in this situation before. His entire career had been built on his authority, his decisions, and his ability to keep control of the courtroom. But now, it was all crumbling around him. The media, the public, even his colleagues were questioning his actions. He had made one serious misstep, and now the consequences were all around him. At the same time, the court of public opinion was beginning to shift. People were starting to demand accountability from Judge Fallon. The calls for his resignation were growing louder. The judge couldn't ignore the reality anymore. He had failed in his duty to uphold justice, and now the eyes of the world were on him. Alia, on the other hand, remained out of the spotlight. She wasn't interested in the media frenzy or the noise surrounding the case. She had other things in mind. The justice she sought wasn't going to be found in headlines or online petitions. It would be found in the courtroom, where the truth would finally be revealed. As the days passed, more and more people began to understand the larger issue at play. This wasn't just about one woman's case. It was about a broken system, a system that needed to change. Alia had spent her entire life fighting for fairness, and now her case was shedding light on the very flaws she had been working to fix. But still, Alia said nothing. Her silence was louder than any protest or statement could ever be. And the world couldn't help but wonder, what was she going to do next? The world was watching Alia Monroe. Her case had become a symbol of injustice, and every person from activists to lawyers was wondering how she would respond. The public was divided. Some were outraged by the judge's unfair ruling, while others believed it was just another case of the justice system working as it should. But Alia remained silent, and her calmness only added to the mystery. Everyone was waiting for her to make her next move. Alia knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't going to play the media game or engage in the noise surrounding her case. She understood that there was a much bigger picture at play, and her fight wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing the deeper flaws within the system that had allowed this injustice to happen. She quietly met with her legal team, and together, they devised a strategy that would turn the tide in her favor. Instead of rushing into an immediate appeal, Alia chose to wait. She knew the right time would come, and when it did, it would be more powerful than anyone could imagine. Alia's lawyer, Ms. Perez, was puzzled at first. "Are you sure about this? We could file an appeal now and get this overturned quickly." Alia smiled. "Patience is key. If we go in too early, they'll underestimate the impact. We need to expose the real issue here, the system itself. If we just fight the sentence, it won't fix anything." Ms. Perez nodded, though she was still unsure. "So, what's the plan?" Alia looked at her lawyer with a steady gaze. "We'll gather the right evidence. We'll bring in the facts about Judge Fallon and his history. We'll show the world what's really happening in our justice system. Only then will they understand why this case matters." Alia wasn't interested in just winning her case. She wanted to change things. She wanted the world to see that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a much larger problem. And she knew the perfect way to expose it. As she continued to strategize, her team worked behind the scenes. They gathered testimonies, reviewed past rulings, and carefully pieced together a story that would reveal the bias and unfair treatment that Judge Fallon had shown in his career. They discovered patterns of racial and gender biases in his rulings, all of which could not be ignored. Meanwhile, The public was growing impatient. People were eager to hear Alia's side of the story, and the longer she stayed silent, the more the pressure mounted. News outlets continued to report on the case, and protests outside the courthouse were becoming more frequent. Alia's name was everywhere, but she remained focused. At last, the time came. Alia's legal team filed a petition to reopen her case, but this time, it wasn't just about her. The petition would bring attention to the systemic issues that had allowed her case to be mishandled. It was time to make the world take notice. In her press conference, Alia stood confidently before the cameras. "This is not just about me. This is about everyone who has been treated unfairly by a broken system. We will not stand idly by and allow injustice to continue. It's time for change." Her words resonated deeply with the public. They weren't just about one woman's fight. They were about the fight for justice itself. And Alia had already won, not in the courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who believed that justice, true justice, would eventually prevail. The pressure was mounting for Judge Richard Fallon. What started as a single mistake in a courtroom was now spiraling into a full-blown scandal. The media had dug deep into his history, and the more they uncovered, the worse it got. Reporters revealed patterns of unfair rulings, especially cases involving racial biases, and soon, people across the country began to demand accountability. Alia Monroe's case was no longer just about a wrongful sentence. It had become a symbol of the deeper issues within the justice system. Judge Fallon had become the face of everything that was wrong. His reputation was tarnished, and now, everyone was questioning his ability to continue as a judge. Inside his office, Fallon sat at his desk, his hands clenched into fists. He had always prided himself on his impartiality, but the recent reports, the protests, and Alia's press conference had shaken him to the core. How had things gotten so out of control? How had his career, built on years of work, come to this? His assistant, Susan, knocked lightly on the door before entering. She looked at him with a mix of concern and hesitation. "Sir, there's a hearing scheduled to address your conduct. The higher courts are investigating your past rulings, and they want an explanation." Fallon's heart sank. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words made it all too real. "I know," he replied quietly. "I don't know how I let it get this far." Susan sat down across from him. "You need to prepare for what's coming. The press will be watching. The public will be listening. This is your chance to explain yourself. But you need to be honest about what happened." Judge Fallon nodded, his mind racing. He knew that no matter what he said, it wouldn't erase the damage he had caused. The truth was out there now, and no amount of excuses could change that. Meanwhile, Alia's legal team continued to gather evidence. They presented the findings to the public, showcasing the patterns of bias in Judge Fallon's rulings. The pressure on him intensified as more and more people became aware of the depth of the issue. Fallon's colleagues began to distance themselves from him, and his position as a judge was now in jeopardy. At the hearing, Alia herself was invited to testify. She stood before the court, calm and composed as always. "I am not here to attack one individual," she said. "I am here to make sure that no one else has to face the kind of injustice I did. This case is just one example of a much larger problem, and we can no longer ignore it." Her words resonated deeply with the court, and the judge who had sentenced her now found himself facing a room full of people who were questioning his integrity. The hearing was a turning point. The public was demanding change, and the pressure on Fallon was overwhelming. In the end, the higher court decided to suspend Judge Fallon pending further investigation. The system had failed Alia once, but now it was finally holding the judge accountable for his actions. Fallon sat alone in his office, staring out the window. His career was in ruins, and all he could think about was how he had allowed his biases to shape his decisions. Alia had shown the world that justice could be achieved, but it wasn't just about her victory. It was about exposing the flaws in the system that had allowed him to make such mistakes in the first place. As the news of his suspension broke, Aaliyah's supporters celebrated, not just for her, but for the future of justice itself. The fight was far from over, but with every step, Aaliyah was making the world a little bit fairer. The courtroom had been silent for what felt like hours. Judge Richard Fallon stood before the panel of higher judges, his face pale with regret. Aaliyah Monroe had testified, and her words had resonated with everyone in the room. She hadn't just spoken for herself. She had spoken for all those who had been wrongly judged, ignored, or silenced by a broken system. Her testimony wasn't just about her case. It was about the need for change, for justice that worked for everyone, not just a few. As the higher court deliberated, Aaliyah waited in the hallway, her lawyer by her side. The weight of the moment was heavy, but she remained composed. She had done everything she could to expose the truth, and now it was up to the court to decide what would happen next. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future of fairness in the justice system. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered. They weren't there for Aaliyah alone. They were there because they believed in what she stood for. Her case had become a symbol of resistance against a broken system. And now, people were hoping for a victory. They wanted to see that the truth would win, that no one would be above the law, no matter their position or power. Hours later, the higher court returned with their decision. The room fell silent as they announced their ruling. Judge Fallon would be suspended indefinitely while the investigation into his conduct continued. It wasn't a full removal from his position yet, but it was a clear statement that his actions could not go unchallenged. The investigation would determine whether he would ever be able to return to the bench. For many, this was a victory. Aaliyah's calm determination had exposed the deep flaws in the system, and now the court had taken action. It wasn't just about her victory. It was about ensuring that no one else would suffer because of biased rulings or unfair treatment. Aaliyah stood tall, her heart beating a little faster, but she didn't show any sign of relief. For her, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. She had always known that justice wasn't something that happened overnight. It was something that had to be fought for, something that required effort and sacrifice from everyone involved. Later that evening, Aaliyah addressed the media. She didn't focus on the judge's suspension or the headlines that had followed her case. Instead, she talked about the future, about how the justice system could and should be better for everyone. This victory, Aaliyah said, isn't just mine. It's for every person who has ever felt like they didn't have a voice. It's for every person who has been wronged, every person who has faced injustice. We can't just fix the broken parts of the system. We need to rebuild it from the ground up, so that it works for all of us. Her words were powerful. Aaliyah had turned her personal struggle into a movement for change. She had reminded everyone that true justice isn't about one case or one person. It's about ensuring that the system works for everyone, regardless of who they are. The media buzzed with stories of her victory, but Aaliyah knew that the fight was far from over. She wasn't interested in personal fame or recognition. She was interested in change. And with every step she took, the world was becoming a little bit more just. Aaliyah had won her case, but more importantly, she had started a movement that would continue to challenge the system. Justice, she knew, was never truly served until it worked for everyone.